The most frustrating thing about modern Resident Evil is the pushback against the old games. As much as we hate to admit it, remakes are often viewed as replacements for the originals, not just by general audiences, but by the developers themselves. Capcom has gone on record saying that they saw no point in porting the old games because the remakes exist. This dismissive attitude has infected the player base like a virus, to the point where people have convinced themselves that classic Resident Evil is outdated and not worth experiencing. If you care about game preservation, then this should be setting off some serious alarm bells. The original Resident Evil quadrilogy is among some of the most beloved and influential games of all time. Even some of the lesser titles stands heads and shoulders above what we get now. They've undoubtedly aged in some areas, but that doesn't mean these games aren't worth the time. This isn't going to be a video dunking on the remakes because they're unique enough to justify their existence. Rather, I'm going to be pushing back on the narrative that there's no reason to play these games anymore. Classic Resident Evil isn't outdated, you've just been told that it is. Let's not waste any time. When I say classic Resident Evil, I'm talking about the games with fixed camera angles and tank controls. Resident Evil might not be the first survival horror game to use this control scheme, but it's undoubtedly the most infamous example of it. To dispel a popular rumor real quick, no, this gameplay style wasn't chosen solely due to hardware limitations. Rather, it was a solution to make navigation smooth with the pre-rendered backgrounds. One of the most common arguments against tank controls is that they're awkward and outdated. If this truly was the best way to experience these games, then the industry would reflect that, though as time has shown us, one of these control schemes flourished while the other has fallen by the wayside, being reserved exclusively for retro callbacks. But here's the thing, just because something isn't used much anymore doesn't mean that the system itself is antiquated. Visual fidelity matters a lot when building tension in a horror game, so Capcom was hell-bent on using pre-rendered backgrounds. This allowed them to circumvent hardware restrictions while still offering an impressive amount of detail. It's in this environment where tank controls thrive while standard analog movement suffers. With tank controls, movement speed and direction can be maintained between camera shifts. This allows the art team to flex their muscles and create some of the most recognizable cinematography in the industry. In order for modern games to achieve this, they need to sacrifice the gameplay experience. What made classic Resident Evil so impressive is that Capcom made this cinematic approach a core part of the aesthetic without restricting the player's actions. Another benefit to this presentation style is that it allows for every part of the map to feel distinct, even if they share similar layouts. In a franchise all about exploration and backtracking, the benefits should be obvious. Tank controls take a minute to get used to, but the benefits offered to the experience greatly outweigh the drawbacks. One of the main aspects of video games that sets them apart from other art forms is their interaction, though not many games use that idea to its fullest potential. Unique controls can enhance an experience in a way that a more standardized layout doesn't offer. Tank controls add a level of tension that doesn't exist in ultra-refined analog settings. For horror games, it allows players to fully connect with the playable characters, since it blurs the line between simulation and reality. In real life, people fuck up and make mistakes all the time when they're tense. That emotion can't be translated effectively when limited solely to cutscenes. When the player avatar acts scared in the story, but is an unshakable titan in gameplay, it creates an inconsistency. The slightly awkward learning curve that comes with tank controls allows for the player-avatar connection to be sustained during gameplay. Even once you master the control style, there's still enough room for error in movements that avoiding combat maintains an appropriate level of tension. If the game instead featured flawless movement, that friction would suddenly disappear. Considered restrictions are the most important part of game design. Without rules, there's no game. Classic Resident Evil follows a strict rule that the player can only be so much stronger than whatever enemy they face. In the original game, Chris and Jill can outrun most danger and attack at a safe distance. To balance this out, corridors are tight, ammo is scarce, and avoiding danger requires the right skill and timing. This dynamic is challenged and evolves as the games progress. RE2 gives the player more weapons and inventory slots to work with, but the resources are shared. Certain items can only be grabbed by one character, so sometimes it's worth leaving them behind for your next run. RE3 boosts Jill's combat abilities exponentially, but it's also the game where you face the most deadly enemy of them all. The modern remakes removing tank controls might have done a lot for ease of access, but an extremely important part of the experience was left behind with it. Choosing to stand your ground in classic Resident Evil is a completely different experience compared to the modern games. If current Resident Evil uses combat as a test of skill, then the classics treat them as an exercise in resource management. Instead of manually needing to aim, the game handles that for you. While that might seem too hands-off to some, it's actually to the game's benefit. Combat was never the main draw, but it serves an important role in the game design. Combat forces players to evaluate their current status, what items they have on hand, and the long-term consequences of expending resources. Every shot fired will hit its mark, but the bullet economy will be permanently lowered with each subsequent pull of the trigger. This forces players to make the most of what they have. Imagine this scenario. You walk into a room and come across 3 zombies clustered together. The only thing on your person is a pistol with a handful of magazines. If you want to progress, then you need to make it down the bottom of these stairs. So what do? Well, you can either try to break through the pack but risk damage in the process, engage in soft combat and fire just enough shots to make it through unscathed, or you can completely dump everything at once, permanently removing those enemies from the game but leaving you empty-handed. Decisions like this don't solely matter in the moment. You can feel their weight echo through the halls as you continue forward. Sometimes you'll make a split-second decision to save yourself, only for that room to ultimately be unimportant in the grand scheme of things. Compounded on this is the limited inventory. Unlike the new games, old-school Resident Evil was brutal with this. Depending on the game, your character could carry anywhere from 6 to 10 separate items. Since every item shares this limited space, deciding what you're going to take outside of the safe room is a constant challenge. Go too hard on the safety nets and you might have to pass up on good pickups. Take all the key equipment with you and you'll have full access to the map, but without any means to defend yourself. Resident Evil's limited inventory is at the heart and soul of the experience, and I always found it strange how much more relaxed it's gotten. In the new games, it's easy to become a walking arsenal. It might not be so obvious at first, but the scales are tipped heavily in your favor, and once the realization sets in, the magic disappears. The old games rarely did this. The only time inventory was expanded was when it could be used as a compelling gameplay choice, or to match the increase in danger. It goes back to what I said. Considered restrictions are what make games fun. Freedom can be nice, but survival horror isn't the place for it. Classic Resident Evil fully embraces this idea, and the games are better off for it. The ink ribbon save system is hotly debated amongst fans. While I appreciate Capcom for adding the option to use them in the new games, it's clear they weren't designed around their implementation. Either they're locked behind the hardest difficulty setting, or are limited to select portions of the game. Classic Resident Evil forces players to engage with limited saves, and while it might sound obtuse at first, it actually makes a lot of sense when considering the rest of the game's design. Aside from the tank controls, this will be the most difficult barrier for new players to overcome. Limited saves are a foreign concept to modern gamers. Unless challenge is the core appeal, players don't respond well to severe punishments for failure. In classic Resident Evil's case, failure sends you back to your last save. People have a strong aversion to repeating content, and if you can't stomach the thought, then I'll just be blunt and say that classic Resident Evil isn't for you. In order for the horror to have the intended effect, death needs to have tangible consequences. Every step taken outside of a safe room is a wager of progress. Make one wrong move, and suddenly all of that hard work can come crashing down. This, combined with the limited number of ink ribbons available, creates a never-ending sense of dread. Deciding where and when to save is a skill in of itself, one that can be refined and improved as you continue playing. At a glance, the classic Resident Evil games are outdated and restrictive, but those seemingly flawed features are what binds the experience together. The Resident Evil remakes are often touted as being respectful because of how unique they are compared to the original games. Despite this, players still treat those vastly different experiences as replacements for the classics. More and more does it feel like remakes are superseding the source material. As someone who cares a lot about the legacy of games and their developers, it's disheartening to see the way people treat history. Resident Evil 4 is one of the most important and influential games of all time, though in the modern remake landscape, it's seen through a distorted lens. Instead of taking Resident Evil 4 for what it is, people only focus on what it isn't. There's nothing wrong with preferring the newer games, but insinuating that the only reason people like these games is because of nostalgia is asinine. Resident Evil has some of the most compelling game design you can find in the genre. They're not perfect games, but they are worth your time. If you were on the fence and now want to give them a shot, the least I can do is help point you in the right direction. If you just want to buy the games and play them, then the easiest way is on PlayStation. The original 3 are free on PS Plus, but can be purchased separately if you just want to own them. However, if you want the most versatile option, then your best bet will be to play the games on PC. Not only do you have access to every game in the franchise, but there's also a plethora of fan projects for the PS1 trilogy. If you're a stickler for resolution, then the Resident Evil Seamless HD project might be up your alley. This project attempts to upscale the backgrounds and FMVs for the original 3 games. It takes a minute to set up, and you'll have to provide your own files. However, for a lot of people, this is the definitive way to experience the classic titles in HD. As admitted by the developers themselves though, the project is far from perfect. If you don't care about the look offered by these mods, then emulation is the next best step. It's never been easier to play retro games on your computer and phone. I got Resident Evil 2 running on Dolphin in less than a minute on my crappy work laptop. The myth that emulation is difficult needs to die. If you end up going down this route, then the only thing I suggest is buying an official copy of these games. About a decade ago, Capcom released an HD remaster of the Resident Evil 1 remake. The overwhelming success of that decision is what influenced Capcom to bring Resident Evil back to its roots. It's easy to imagine a world where the old style of Resident Evil can coexist with the modern direction. But that won't be possible unless Capcom sees that there's a market for it. So for the new fans listening in, get on it. The worst case scenario is that you don't like them, and the best is that they become some of your favorite games of all time. At least then, you can actually say you've played a Resident Evil game.